You may remember last week when the story broke, we were talking about the government making some changes. Mark Miller was being quoted, Randy Boissonault being quoted, ministers of immigration and employment specifically, about changes being made because a lot has been talked about with respect to temporary foreign workers, temporary foreign residents, the fact that we have taken in more, I think, in the past year or so than we ever have before. Another Stats Canada numbers out in December showing the biggest increase, I think, since 1957, if I'm not mistaken. The Minister of Employment, Randy Boissonault, the Honourable, is in studio. Thank you for coming in.
My pleasure.
You're making this a habit.
I'm happy to keep coming
you
back.
Want to think about that. That's never a good idea. Let's talk a little bit about this. Sure. I know I had someone on last week after this was announced from the Restaurant Association here in Quebec. Look, I understand. I think most people do. When you look at the numbers, I mentioned 1 million people. That's a lot of people. And the percentage of people, of those people who are temporary foreign residents, workers, et cetera, leads the way in those numbers. So the government clearly had to do something. What was the thinking behind this? Is this about housing? Is it about employment? What's it about?
So if we take a look at the numbers, the temporary foreign worker program, which I run, I oversee, is about 250,000 people last year. And it breaks down into 5 different streams. Now, I'm not a big fan of these names. I'm working on this part. But there's a low-wage stream, a high-wage stream, permanent resident stream. Then there is a global talent stream. And there's also another stream, which is the primary agriculture stream. So what we announced last week was the fact that if you go back 2 years, Aaron, we had 1 million vacancies coming out of the pandemic. And we had Restaurant Association, other people saying to us, look, we've got a cap of 20% of our workforce that can come from temporary foreign workers. We already do the labor market impact assessment. Would you let us go up to 30? Because if we don't have that 30% critical mass to keep our restaurant open or our hotel, then the whole thing has to shut down. So as a temporary measure, we increased that from 20% to 30%. Now I take a look at the numbers and we got 650,000 vacancies, but 1.2 million Canadians that want to go to work. And so the other thing I did last week is I said, okay, we're going to go from 30 down to 20, but before you get your temporary foreign worker approved to come in, you've got to prove to our department that a Canadian, a permanent resident, a refugee, nor an asylum seeker actually want to take that job. Because why wouldn't we give the job to the people who are already here?
To which my question would be, how could you possibly do that, asking that, look, I put an ad or did whatever I had to do to prove that someone who lived here didn't want that job before I give it to someone who's a temporary resident? Number one. And number two, and as much as I understand we're not in a pandemic anymore, that going from 30 back to 20, restaurants have probably been the last business to recover at all after the pandemic. This seems to be making a bit more difficult on them. And look, I know that within this plan, there are exceptions made, right?
You are right.
One is for healthcare, one is for construction, you have fisheries, agriculture. Why specifically not extend it and cover restaurants as well? Because a lot of mom and pop places, from what I heard last week, based on this, may be forced to close. So
there's a bit of a wrinkle here. And if you're a restaurant or a hotel, like you just mentioned, that's in the tourism sector, then there's an exemption that applies because of, there's a 270-day exemption that would apply in that sector. And before you and I met, I was the Minister of Tourism. So I understand how much this matters. And if we take a look at what we're talking about, this particular low-wage stream is going to keep about 7,000 people from coming to the country on a total of about 60,000. So we're talking about a 12% reduction. So look, there's lots of pressure for me to go lower than that. But I said, I'm going to do this first reduction, go back to where we were at the end of the pandemic, see what the effect on the ground is, and then I'll be able to make other adjustments if we need to. What I'm encouraging people, to your earlier question, how do we get them to do this? Well, they got to reach out to the Newcomer Center. They got to reach out to Indigenous partners. There are partners and organizations that want to work with employers to get people in their businesses, including in the rural Canada, rural Quebec. And so we're going to work with those partners to get that work done. I want to see businesses flourish. I was in the private sector before politics, and I don't want to see anybody squeezed by this. At the same time, I want to make sure that this stream isn't keeping wages artificially low.
Yet at the same time, as I hear you say this, I think back to previous discussions we've had where people will tell us, and this seems to be uniform, there are simply people here who are already here, never mind people coming in, temporary foreign workers, who simply don't want to fill these jobs, these, let's call them minimum wage jobs, and that's why they go to these other people. Do you not put much benefit or much authority in that?
Absolutely we do. And that's in part why the agricultural stream, which is about 25% of my program, look, I'll give you the case of Mexico. Like, we've had Mexicans come to and from Canada every year to work in our ag sector for 50 years. That's how long the agreement's been in place with Mexico. Jamaica's been on board for several decades. I have other countries that want to be scoped into this program. And so, look, what Canadians ask us to do, and I think Miller would have said this to you if he was here, is they expect the immigration system to be managed intake. And what's happened is some of these programs, because they didn't count to our immigration levels every year, all of this stuff now has to be taken as a, like we say in French, un vue d'ensemble. We have to take the overall picture. And I'm doing my part to make sure we have that control of the system. But again, if it causes a distortion that we don't like, that's going to affect businesses, I'll take another look at it. In the short term, though, I want wages to go up, and I want Canadians, permanent residents, refugees, and asylum seekers to get first crack.
So I know there's been backlash to this. You just mentioned Mark Miller. He's the Minister of Immigration. Tom Mulcair, who's a regular contributor here on the radio station, was talking about this last week. I want you to hear what he had to say.
This is an impending disaster. This is pure incompetence on the part of the person who is responsible, and that is the minister. That's Mark Miller's fault. Mm-hmm. He should have seen this coming. He should have people around him saying, boss, watch out. This is an economic and social disaster. Price of vegetables, price of groceries going to go even higher in Quebec and in other areas where you need these temporary foreign workers. They're the ones, Andrew, who work the fields. I've been to those fields many times in my political career. You get to meet people. You see most of those owners of those big market garden operations. They're very good with those workers because they want them back. Now there's often second and third generations coming to the same farm. And these are people who have contributed mightily. They're paid decently. The government's doing a better job of supervising their conditions. But heaven to Betsy, get the visas out and get those workers into the province. It makes no sense what's happening.
There's a lot there, but I want to take the last part first.
Sure.
The idea that part of the failure here, if we can call it that, has been the fact that processing these people, getting them their documents, getting them their work permits, has caused part of the problem. Do you acknowledge that?
So what I acknowledge, and you and I have talked about this before, is that Quebec has its own responsibility when it comes to the immigration system. When it comes to asylum seekers and temporary foreign workers in other provinces getting their permits, it can be as fast as 4 weeks. Some provinces get it done in 2. So,
wait a second. 4 weeks?
Yeah, in Alberta, an asylum seeker gets if they don't get their permit in 4 weeks, I pick up the phone and ask what's going on.
So now, as
It's
I
a year
understand
here.
this, it's longer than a year here in some cases.
And so, again, this is where Madame Frechette and Minister Miller have said they will do more coordination. But look, I'll be straight up with you, Aaron. Minister Miller and I met with the Mexican ambassador last week about this very issue. So there was an issue with a couple of plants where their workers weren't getting their counterfoils, their visas, put in their passports at a given time. By the end of that meeting, the Mexican officials and we agreed that if we have to make sure that our officials are at the airports in Mexico to put those visas in their passports so that they can get here for the season, we will do that. And Mr. Mulcair is incorrect about what we announced last week. The primary ag stream is not what we've reduced. What he was talking about was a few passports not getting processed in time from the Mexican side, but we are not talking about any big disturbance in the ag sector because I don't want food prices to go up.
Right.
And these are, like I said, 50-year agreements. And Mr. Mulcair is right. We have some families where the second generation is now coming here. And look, they want to work for 4 to 6 months and then they want to go back home. It's good for Mexico. It's good for Canada. And it's good for the agricultural sector.
So you want to take down the number from 6.2% to 5% population-wise, right, as far as temporary foreign residents coming to Canada?
Indeed.
Okay. The problem, I guess, with that is we know the situation, or we're told the situation will continue to get worse year after year. There are more people seeking to leave whatever country they happen to be from and coming into Canada. Is this a permanent solution? Do we have to keep readjusting this over time? What has to happen here?
You put your finger on it, and when Minister Miller and I did our press conference last week, he had this question about what do we do when there's another hotspot like Ukraine in the world? Like we're talking about 300,000 people of the almost 1 million, visas that were processed. By the end of March, we're probably going to have 300,000 Ukrainians coming here. So what would we say to the next conflict in the world? And that's where on a regular basis, we're going to have to counterbalance that new 5%. Because look, when I became an MP 8 years ago, it was about 75, 80 million displaced people in the world. We're at 125 million now. Like 10 years out, we're looking at 200 million people displaced. So what's Canada's role in taking asylum seekers and refugees? That we have signed international conventions. We have to keep doing that. And I'm the jobs minister. So 100% of our labor force growth comes from newcomers. And by 2032, all of our population is going to come from newcomers. So we've got to figure this out so that we don't, 10 years from now, have a huge gap in our workforce like we had coming out of the pandemic. And it's why today at the Montreal Chamber of Commerce, I shared that I'm pulling together a skills summit this fall in Ottawa, and it hasn't happened since Jason Kenney was in my chair in 2012. Think of all the things that we've been through as a country since then, and I want to cast out what does our workforce need to be like for the next 10 years, and we're going to mix it all together. We're going to put the unions, workers, we're going to put employers, officials, people that recognize people's competencies, get them all in the same room and figure this out.
30 seconds. I want to ask you this, then I'm going to go to our listeners.
Sure.
Was there a mistake made by this government in allowing too much immigration? Too many of these people to come here. I mentioned the number just in the last year, highest it's been since 1957. Was that a pandemic issue? Why did we not see that coming?
Well, so part of the issue was we were tracking, but we also left it up to the provinces to decide how many people would come for the international student issue. So you saw Minister Miller and our government jump on that a few months ago. And that's an important fact. Look, some universities got addicted to cash flow from foreign students paying, exorbitant international fees. We need to cap that. So that's now been capped for the next 2 years until we rationalize that.
Okay.
The next thing was this thing about foreign residents, and going from 6%, 6.2 to 5 is like a 19% reduction. So we're going to do that, and then we'll see where we are.
Minister, I do thank you. I appreciate you coming. I should mention today, you surprised we were talking off air. You're going to speak into the Quebec Community Groups Network later today before you go back to Ottawa, right?
Absolutely. We've given money to Littératie Quebec to help people in the English-speaking community learn French so they can get in the labor force. Unemployment's about 10% in the English-speaking community in Quebec. We can do better. And by making sure people have skills to access the French labor force here, they'll be able to make a living.
You know that our own minister said last week provincially it would take $13 billion to provide French courses for everybody who would want to take. I mean, a staggering amount of money. I'm not going to ask you about that now, but you might want to look into that.
And I'll come back and we'll chat about that and other things.
We will. Thank you so much for coming in.